Welcome to Book Banter with me, your host, Dianne Burkhart. I hope you will join me every Wednesday as we explore all things to do with, well, books. Let's get on with our show today. Hello, my happy people, and welcome to another episode of Book Banter with Dianne Burkhart. Today is June 14th, and have we got a show for you? We have got a fabulous historical epic fantasy author. Her name is Angela R. Hughes, and she will be with us here in just a moment. I just want to tell you, I have been doing my best to try to keep the episodes to about 30 minutes, trying not to go over 45 minutes. And to definitely not make 2 or 3 part episodes anymore, because I have noticed that usually people do not come back as often for the second or third episodes. You want it all in the first one and you want somebody different the next time. I got the message. I'm trying to do that. But whenever you have a guest like the one that I have today, who is just fascinating and has such a wealth of knowledge that you want to keep everything that she has to say, it's really hard to edit these down for time. I did my best to try and keep all of the great information without cutting out too much, but also maybe if there was a little bit of repetition in one section to the next, trying to cut out the second part, but making sure that all of the basic information is there and you get to hear her wonderful wit and insight and inspiration. I'm doing my best. I hope that you like the way that these shows are coming out, and we have got some fantastic author guests coming up in the next month and a half. You're just going to love them. So without further ado, let's get to Angela, and be sure to hang on until the very end, because at the end of her interview, she actually reads from her current book in her series. And afterwards, I will tell you about the other authors who are coming up later this month. So without further ado, please welcome Angela R. Hughes to the show. Welcome to Book Banter with Dianne Burkhart. I am so excited to be talking to you today. And why don't you explain to our listeners who you are?
Hi, my name is Angela R. Hughes. I am the author of the Once and Future Chronicles series. I am what you would call an Arthurian Legends nerd. Actually, more than that, I am probably a mythology, particularly Celtic mythology nerd. I love history. I love the history of particularly England, Scotland, Ireland, and the whole Celtic history. I am currently living in Waco, Texas. I have 2 children, and I actually work for a publishing company, and I am a writing coach, which I really enjoy doing, mostly because I love equipping people to tell the stories that are inside them. And sometimes writing a book can feel like a daunting task, especially if you've never done it before. I like to help people know that they can tell their stories. So it's kind of a passion of mine, as well as telling my own stories in the Once and Future Chronicles. The Once and Future Chronicles, my first book, is Elanor and the Song of the Bard. It chronicles kind of a more historical view of Arthurian legend, kind of the stories that most people don't know are part of Arthurian legend. And then my own twist, of course, of time, and book 2, Merlin and the Magic of Time, just released on Wednesday.
Now, I know you actually list your books as historical epic fantasy.
Yes.
What about it makes it that epic fantasy?
Well, it definitely has the historical elements as far as the setting and the time and the place. I've done a lot of research as far as trying to accurately portray as much as possible. Of course, I still have the whole romantic idea of fantasy involved in my storytelling. So I had that whole historical element of real myth, real legend, some aspects of Arthurian legend that are real to what's been written about Arthurian legend. But I like to include the fantasy elements, the high fantasy elements like the fae or the fairies, the dragons, and the mythical beasts and demons and creatures of the other world that my characters encounter. And then you have the adventure that they go on and the journey that they go through that is very high fantasy.
Now, as somebody who also writes historical fiction, do you ever find yourself doing so much research that it almost feels like you're doing more research than actual writing?
Yes. I think before I even started writing the series, just because I wanted to honor those who would read my books that are as involved with Arthurian legend as I am.
Mm-hmm.
So I found myself taking university courses on Arthurian legend and going down that rabbit hole very extensively. But I would go down that rabbit hole, and even to the point when you're researching, well, what poisons would have been available in the 5th century?
Yes.
That's probably one of the oddest things about researching something as a writer. When you're researching like poisons or
Yeah.
things like that, you're like, please Google, I'm not trying to research how to actually murder somebody. I've really tried to do my best to really research this well, but then give myself permission to write what's in me, the story that I really want to tell without needing permission. And that can be difficult when you're writing something that's historical, because you really do want to make sure that you're also keeping that context in mind.
Well, and you went a little bit further than just taking some classes on Arthurian legend. You actually lived in Ireland for a while, didn't you?
Yes, I did. I actually lived there for 2 years. And then I also done some traveling in England and Wales, just those regions. But it definitely ignited something in me for the landscape and the mythology. I think different people are pulled towards different things. And for me, there was something about the history and the land and being there, absorbing it. It felt alive to me. I felt connected to it. The ancient history and the things that still remain in more European nations, there's something so alive and electric to me. The ruins that still exist, and lay my hands on it and experience it. I want to know the history. There's so much of Arthurian legend that did exist, that is true to history, and then so much of it that was captured by the Welsh poets and the Welsh historians that maybe became more fiction as things developed. But just to know, like, I think that's part of my journey of these books. I wish I could have gone back in time to see what aspects were real.
What exactly is it about Celtic mythology that fascinates you so much?
Good question. Part of it is the fact that I lived there. I was really fascinated with a lot of the history post-Roman, how the land changed, and then the Romans left, and a lot of them, the Celtics, started kind of trying to go back to their original roots. There was such an ancient, different way of thinking about life. You look at some of the older ancient cultures, like the Egyptians or the Sumerians, and kind of the way they thought about the spirit world. And a lot of the mythology that is most popular, like Greek mythology and Roman mythology, you have the whole idea of gods and goddesses and, the spirit world interacting with humans. And we call that myth, but I'm like, I think through the lens of people who lived in that time, maybe there were certain realities that they funneled into those myths that just don't make as much sense to us now. And something about Celtic mythology, the development of that world, there's a lot when it comes to Arthurian legend and even Celtic mythology that even kind of connects to Atlantis. And a lot of these older worlds, like the original people coming to Ireland or even England, encountering giants. And I think I've always been a very imaginative child growing up, wanting to imagine certain things to be real.
Yeah.
Did the stones actually get there because giants threw them? Just all of those kinds of questions. And something about Celtic mythology really touches some of that fantasy element that fascinated me as a child reading books like George MacDonald or C.S. Lewis. My story takes place before there were castles and knights and a round table. It's an older mythology or legend of King Arthur. But just to think that there were men of honor or people that believed in something beyond just their present circumstances, that they fought and died for. Brotherhood is a big theme in my books. An essential thing that grasps me, and something about Celtic mythology, this brotherhood, this fighting, living, dying for one another, it energizes me.
That is an incredible message to put through the books.
Oh, thank you.
And one of the reasons why I was excited about getting to talk to you with your books, when I was a kid, my absolute favorite movie was a musical called Camelot.
Oh,
I
yes.
cannot even tell you how many times I saw that movie. I knew it backwards and forwards. I knew all of the music, and it was the basic storyline that got me. Just that history of Arthur and the Round Table and the knights and how they all came together and stood shoulder to shoulder through everything. That was just a fantastic message, I thought.
I've always asked myself, what is so fascinating about Arthurian legend to me? What captured me about it? And then you look at the history. Before I got into Arthurian legend, I thought there was one book about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table.
Oh, wow.
Only as I studied it and went down that road of discovery with Arthurian legend did I discover that these stories had been told literally from early recordings of first century, people telling stories of this hero and these men that would live and die for one another. These essential stories have been told and retold almost more times than the Bible has been translated. And
Wow.
you're like, what is it about this story of King Arthur that has so captured people throughout the ages that it has been written, rewritten, retold? I mean, how many movies, even like you said, there's a musical, stage plays have been written about King Arthur. I even asked myself when I was writing my story, I'm like, does there really need to be another story about King Arthur? And my ultimate answer was yes, absolutely, because there's something that resonates so strongly with this story. And not only is it the heroes, but it's the tragedy.
Yeah.
Some of the stories that just resonates and needs to be told and retold. But it definitely captured me, obviously, well enough that I felt like I wanted to write a series, including it.
Well, and the one thing that always got me about the story of King Arthur was the story about the Round Table, that he did
Mm,
not want a regular table because he wanted everybody to be equal. He didn't want
yes.
anyone to be seen as having a hierarchy in the ranks because it was important that this brotherhood was all seen as equal.
Which is fascinating, even in the storytelling, because the Round Table would have been written about in the 12th century.
Mm-hmm.
And that concept and idea of people being equals was not the narrative of the day.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a very unique idea that was being written down about this legendary king or chieftain, that he would want them to be equals. It would have been like a controversial idea, but he did. That's that brotherhood piece. There was a trust and an honor in one another. And that's something that was really fun for me to include in my books, because again, this is an older time where there would have been more rugged warrior like people of the 5th and 6th century kind of took this idea of a tiled floor depicting the great bear of King Arthur and all of his warriors around him. So it became like this floor of equality where they stood upon these circles together instead of it actually being a wooden table, something a little bit more older and ancient.
That's interesting. I would love to see a painting of that.
That's a good idea. I should try to depict that. But I think that's where I really like to let my imagination wander with this, was if there really was a King Arthur that was 5th or 6th century, if there were these warriors, like what would they have looked like translated in a time where there wasn't knights, but there was still honor, where there were spears instead of swords, or instead of armor, you had Celtic colors and leather bound chest plates instead, and really developing this fantasy world, because we don't really know. I mean, you can take from history, like what the warriors maybe would have looked like, the culture. But again, you would have had your Roman looking warriors mixed within them because they had been conquered by Rome for so many years.
Yeah.
What would that have looked like, and how would that have influenced the tales in a kind of a different spin?
What story connected to Arthur do you think is most surprising?
I think for me, the part of the Arthurian legend that really gripped me, and I think it's the story that I think of every single time I think of Arthurian legend, and it was one that really inspired me to write about Arthur, was especially if you look into the older tales of King Arthur, the sword he pulls from the stone is not Excalibur. It is actually Euralius' sword. So depending on the mythos that you read, there's Uther and then there's Euralius. In some tellings, Uther is Arthur's father. In other tellings, it's Euralius who is Uther's brother. But that sword being placed in the stone by Merlin so that the right heir would pull it free. Arthur pulls that sword and actually goes into battle. And that sword is broken. It shatters into pieces. And so does Arthur, because he goes, this is what made me king. And he's not even king yet. In some of the earlier tellings, he pulls the sword. He's not king automatically. He's like, all of my calling destiny that was attached to something I pulled from the stone that is now shattered into pieces. There was something gripping to me about the loss. And you'll see those themes a lot in my stories I write. What happens next when loss comes, when things seem hopeless, or when you feel cornered and you can't necessarily see the solution to where hope could be resurrected again? Seeing Arthur with that broken sword is just pivotal to me. And this is where he goes on the journey with Merlin, and he discovers the Lady of the Lake and discovers that he is called, and he's given Caladfolk, which is the Celtic Welsh version of Excalibur. The calling this time is that he really is truly king, and he's able to embrace that calling. And I think for me, and I think this is what I love about mythology and I love about legends and stories like this, is that really can even speak to us today. So many of us carry swords that were not meant to carry. They weren't made for us. Arthur wasn't meant to carry his father's sword. There was a sword that was his own. And sometimes we weigh ourselves down carrying somebody else's burden instead of finding the actual calling. You know, maybe that sword is what brought Arthur to a place of being able to embrace his calling, but it wasn't his sword. It wasn't made for him, and it wouldn't have worked. In fact, it shattered. And sometimes we have to come to that place of our sword shattering, of tragedy, of loss, to find out really who it is that we are and maybe who we thought we had been. That particular story, I still like to dig my fingers into that and pull up little truths that I've gleaned from it.
That is some incredible insight.
Thank you.
I mean, I love that whole concept. That's fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
Now, one of the things that a lot of authors struggle with is finding the right cover art.
Ooh,
and
yes.
I think that the cover art that you have for your books is just amazing. How did you come to those images?
Well, you know, I have to say it was a learning curve and an obstacle course. You can still see, if you were to search me on Google, some of the older cover versions of Elanor and the Song of the Bard. The original cover for Elanor and the Song of the Bard is absolutely beautiful. As an artist, I was so excited to work with the designer. After writing the book, that was like the second most exciting thing for me. And this beautiful cover was designed only to find out that after the book was released, people weren't picking it up and buying it. My publisher and I kind of re-looked at the book and thought, I think it's the cover. And I was kind of bummed because I was so attached to the cover. It was so beautiful. It's kind of like the new cover. It had this image of a woman with flowing hair, but a lot of the historical elements were missing. When you looked at it, in hindsight, I can look at that cover and go, wow, it looks like a romance.
Yeah.
And so I was appealing to the wrong audience. Now, one of the things I've discovered about cover art is you have to be careful to be creative and make a beautiful cover, but not be so unique that you've now put yourself outside the bounds of the type of people that buy your book.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I have learned with fantasy art on cover design in particular, simple is best. Pick 3 main elements from your book, have them on your cover. And if there is a dragon in your book, put it on the cover.
Yeah.
You want to really know your audience well. And one of the things I did was research, what do the rest of the covers look like in my specific genre? Picking out ones that had elements that drew my eye, and then developing a cover from there. But I think even with this new cover, there's still some of my artistic flair in there. So you don't have to throw it away. But original isn't always best. You want to really look at what works. So I put a dragon on the cover, and I put some Celtic stones on the cover, and then I had my character. But, you know, I had a journey learning what a cover should look like. In the end, I felt like it was a good combination of my creativity and what I envision of the story, and trying to put it in one little image on the cover as simply as I possibly could.
And you can tell me if you agree with this or not, but I have found that a lot of times writing the story is often the easiest part of the whole process. That coming up with your cover and doing the marketing tend to be the hardest parts.
Without a doubt. I mean, for me, writing the story is, though it can be a big process. You write the story, then you rewrite the story, then you rewrite it again. You have to go through all of the edits with maybe 2 or 3 editors. But there's something about writing a story where, for me, it's like playing the best game of pretend you can as an adult.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that as an adult, I get to recapture myself as a child and actually share it with other people. The unraveling of a story as I'm writing it is such a beautiful piece. And I think even though it takes discipline and time, discovering storytelling and writing kind of as a gifting and calling was my favorite thing ever in my life. Writing, though it takes discipline, was so fun and continues to be fun for me because I'm going on the adventure with my characters too. And I think, what's the movie about Charles Dickens that just came out? Oh gosh. The Man Who Invented Christmas. I love that movie because in it depicts his characters actually talking to him. And that happens, you're in your story and all of a sudden your character grabs you by the nape of the neck and says, that's not going to happen.
Yes.
This is going to happen. And there's something so fun about that development as a writer, getting to kind of interact with your characters and take them and bring them to life. But then comes the technical bits. Nobody, I don't think, is a writer and author signs up and goes, oh, I'm going to have to become a marketer. I'm going to have to become an expert of cover design. I'm going to have to, know all of the details about how a book should come together. And I think especially with my first book, I think every author with their first book, it's a lot of different obstacle courses. I had to tell myself when I came to that phase, you can learn this. You can learn this. If you're meant to write books, then you're meant to learn this. You can do this. And if I can't, there's somebody who can help me,
Yeah. Now, how long did it take you to do the first book?
It only took me 8 months to write the first book. When I decided that this story was worth being told, I kind of got this bug in me that it needed to be written. I just dove right in, and literally I would put my kids to bed at night, and I'm a night owl, and I would write until 1, 2 in the morning every night until the book was done. I continued to do that on through book 2. So I started writing the first book in 2020, and I am almost done with book 3 in 2023. So a book a year, it seems like.
Considering how long your books are, that's an impressive timeline.
Thank you.
because these are not small novellas here. We're talking like 400 plus page novels.
Yes. Yeah. You'll find Merlin and the Magic of Time is a little bit of a smaller book. And part of that is just because as the story continued, it needed to go on to book 3. And that one will be a big, thicker book like book 1 was. But I would just sit down and write. And I didn't experience a whole lot of writer's block. There were times where it got hard to write. And I just would tell myself, just keep writing. You can fix this later. Yeah. Because I felt like when I got to a hard part, if I stopped to wait for it to fully develop, then I was never going to get through it. And so I would just write it and tell myself, hey, you can come back and fix this later. So really push through some of the hard parts just so that I could get to the parts that I was really excited about. It was almost like motivation for me. Like, no, you want to get to this part that you're really excited about. You can get through this scene and fix it later. And it was amazing how oftentimes I wasn't enjoying writing a scene, or it was like, for lack of a better word, like the constipated parts of my book that were hard to write. How I would get through those, and it was like tooth and nail to write them. And then I would reread them, and the gold I would find in them. I was like, how did I write that when I wasn't even feeling like I was enjoying the process as much? And it really taught me a lesson that it really kind of doesn't matter how I'm feeling about a portion of my book. I mean, I think our favorite parts as writers is always that feeling that you get when you're writing, when the magic happens and you get on that writer's stream and you're just going. But I've also learned that when I get to the parts that are harder to write, that I just kind of have this self-talk where I go, it doesn't matter that you're feeling like this is hard. It doesn't mean that the quality of your work is now going down the tubes or that this part of the story doesn't matter. Just kind of coaching myself through it so that I didn't stop. Because I'm definitely a disciplined person, but I'm one of those people that once you put something down, it's hard to pick it back up again. So recognizing my own telltale signs of what I do when I stop. And for me, I recognized right away that what I was doing wasn't a hobby.
Yeah.
It was a calling. There was an importance to me, even if nobody ever read my book, but my family and friends, for me, even just for my children and for just leaving a legacy, it was important to me to write the stories and take it seriously.
Now, do you keep up with how your book is standing in the rankings on things like Amazon?
Yes, I do. I pay attention to it. And then there's times where I kind of have to give myself a break from it. I want my books to do well, but the reason I wrote them wasn't to make money.
Do you know where Merlin and the Magic of Time is standing right now?
Last week it was number 1 5 days in a row.
Yeah.
It's now slipped down in the rankings a little bit, but I plan on helping that kind of boost again.
See, but it is trending so well in Arthurian fantasy and mythology. It's doing very well.
Which is super exciting to me. It helps me feel like even people enjoyed book 1 to buy book 2 so eagerly. Mm-hmm. I must have done something right with the first one for the second one when it came out to do so well.
And it's getting great reviews.
Thank you. Yes.
Now, this is the point where we try and do 5 quick questions that never turn out to be quick, but we're going to try it anyway. Question 1. Who is your favorite character in Arthurian Legends?
Geez, that's a hard one, but I have to say, even though we've been talking about King Arthur this whole time, Merlin is my favorite. I think part of it is because he's magical, he's mysterious, and there's so many different versions of him. Yeah. Merlin's like the other side of the coin of Arthur. And even in my stories, I have a more relatable, younger version of Merlin. And if you look at some of the older Arthurian legend, you'll see that there are depictions of him as a younger person and sometimes even a changeling and having a lot of different kinds of powers. And then there's also some really negative versions of Merlin. But there's something about him as just a mage, something magical, something mysterious, someone who shouldn't have been, someone who chose to do good when he was created to do bad. You look at the old mythology of Merlin, demons basically created him, and he was born to help their kingdom, the fairy kingdom or the demon kingdom, depending on the version that you're reading, to help them take rulership of the earth. And he chose not to do that. That wasn't who he wanted to be. And I always love that about stories when you've got these people who are set up almost by fate or destiny to be evil, and they go, no, thanks. You're telling me who I'm supposed to be, but that's not who I feel that I am. And there's something about those kind of characters that makes you want to cheer for them.
Question 2. What is the favorite site that you have visited that has a connection to Arthur mythology?
I don't know if there is. Trying to think of a favorite site that I've been to. There's Glastonbury, which, it's funny, you look at some of the actual historical context, it's become connected to Arthurian legend. Potentially it's, the island of Avalon, all of these things. And then a lot of that's, this is the bunk version. This is what was kind of an old 11th century prank or whatever that made this spot Arthurian legend epic. But there's still something a little heart thumping and heart pounding about seeing it. Yeah. One of my dreams my husband and I have on our bucket list is to actually go and hit all of the hot spots of Arthurian legend, not just in England and Wales, but also in France, and even Germany has its roots in Arthurian legend, and just kind of hit some of these hot spots like the Hadrian's Wall. I really, really, really want to go see Hadrian's Wall. It would take a long time to literally hit all of these places.
Definitely worth the travel, though.
Yes.
Number 3, what is a favorite memory that you have of being at a book signing or a fan meet and greet with just somebody who's interested in your books?
It's almost so humbling when you have people, especially, I think some of my favorite things is you've got your friends and you've got your families and your support systems, people who have read your books. But when you meet a stranger, someone who has read your book and loves them, that light in their eyes, it speaks volumes. You're like, wow, somebody else has captured this story besides just me. But I have to say that my favorite experience as an author with someone who enjoyed my book and read it and came to me was actually when I was signing my book for my older sister. There's a scene in my book where Merlin stands up at a dinner table and he begins to do what he does. He sings this bardic song that is kind of releases a magic into the room. And there's people around this table and none of them are able to hear the song, at least hear it the way that it's meant to be heard because their hearts are hard. But there's one character at the table, David, who hears the song and he understands it. And my sister said, I feel like I'm David sitting around the table and I'm the only one that can hear the song.
Wow.
And it hit me so profoundly. It made me feel like the reason I wrote the book was worthwhile. My sister said, I feel like I got inner healed when I read your book. She's like, because I know what you're talking about. I know where that came from. And so for me, that was just a very fulfilling moment. You know, I think for me, I've always looked up to my older sister. And so for her to say that was really powerful and dynamic to me and stuck out to me as probably one of my most favorite experiences as far as somebody reading my book and coming back to me.
Question 4. For you, what is the hardest part about being an author?
Marketing.
Yeah.
I think that's the hardest part. And yet through marketing, I have met so many other amazing authors. It's fun to get to meet people like that and get to discuss the stories with other people who understand where stories come from.
Yeah.
I mean, so there's the benefits to it, but that's the work piece for me. Discovering, especially because it's always morphing and changing, because there's all the ways that you're supposed to market. It's always changing and, keeping up with everything. And yet at the same time, I've given myself permission to go, yeah, but that's not how I'm going to do it in certain aspects. I'm a storyteller and I want to remain that throughout all of the way that I market. I think somebody told me once, they said, marketing is best when you are you times 12.
Yeah.
So it needs to be me at my passionate best, because that's what's going to make people read the book, is them knowing how passionate I am about my stories, not them feeling like I'm just trying to sell them a book.
Well, and I think people are becoming so marketing savvy anymore that they can tell when somebody is being inauthentic.
Yes.
And that is a huge turnoff. But when somebody, it doesn't matter how nerdy or how goofy you are, if you are being your authentic, true self and just being honest with your audience,
Yes.
it comes across and people connect with that. Question 5. Do you enjoy doing interviews like this or do you dread them?
I love them. I think part of the reason is because I love talking about what I love, which is my stories and my books. It gives me an opportunity to nerd out. And I'm a public speaker. Before I was even an author, I like speaking. I like being in front of people. But I have to say, there is always that intimidation that comes before an interview.
Yeah.
Like, what question are they going to ask? Is there going to be something that all of a sudden in the moment, I don't know? So I always have those kind of like little nerves. I don't know. I always have this thing in me. I want to honor the people that are inviting me on. You're like, I hope I'm going to do, their podcast justice, or whoever's interviewing me justice. So there's always that little bit of pressure. But always, once I'm on doing the interview, sometimes I have to tell myself, okay, Angela, be quiet now. Stop talking. Because I get so excited and I am passionate about my stories and my books. And I feel like my stories are worth reading. So it gives me an opportunity to talk about it to people who also love stories. So I get excited.
Why don't you give us a little bit of a synopsis of your first book?
The Once and Future Chronicles, my first book, is Elanor and the Song of the Bard. Begins where Arthurian legend ends. And I think that's what makes my stories so unique. I'm not necessarily retelling a story that's been told already a million times. My books start kind of at the cataclysmic event of Arthur's death and what happens next. It essentially starts with a character, Merlin. And again, he's kind of a younger version of Merlin. But he's reeling all of the destiny, all of the promise, all of the things that he has been fighting for long before Arthur was even born. All of the things that he was even destined for come crashing down because Arthur died and he wasn't supposed to. And it starts with Merlin kind of in grief. And the entirety of my story really is about, is there anything on the other side of everything falling apart? And it starts out with Merlin going, I don't think I can go on. Actually, I think I'm done. And then comes this new character, and I have the fun element of time travel. But this new character, Elanor, who comes into the fray, and kind of starts to reawaken the land, reawaken Merlin through the relationship that they have, the magic that gets reawakened, and kind of this old kingdom that was meant to fade and die doesn't, maybe in fact need to die. So this is kind of the synopsis of my book. Elanor is a very pivotal character in my story. Her journey goes through a lot of fatherlessness. It's very important for me in my own life to understand identity. Elanor is one of those people who comes into kind of the story with a lack of identity and not knowing who she is and why she should even be an important part of anything. I think that people identify with the story trope of the chosen one.
Yeah.
And there is kind of that trope a little bit in my story as far as Elanor being someone who seems to maybe be chosen, but she doesn't know why, and neither does anybody else. And kind of on this journey of like the mystery of discovering what it's all about. And I think that was one of the fun parts of my book and continues throughout the series, is kind of this mystery that slowly unravels throughout these questions that start just with a bang at the very beginning of the story that make you want to turn the page and find out, what is this all about? What is the mystery? Why is Elanor here? You know, there's the mystery of how she even ends up in the 5th century, which makes it a fun read.
So how does that lead into book 2?
So in book 2, we're picking up, there is this cataclysmic event at the end of book 1. Merlin and Elanor are separated. And there is a magic that pulls Merlin through time. He is desperately hoping to find Elanor. And this kind of starts the whole next part of the story. Is there a way to find her now that he's stuck through time, taking all of this 5th century Merlin and putting him into a modern era and discovering that maybe there's more to the future than just finding Elanor. Maybe it has to do with Arthur as well.
Now, would you like to read a little bit from book 2?
Absolutely. All right. So this is book 2, Merlin and the Magic of Time. Chapter 1, The Bookshop. Merlin walked through the door of the bookshop, his heart thumping and his fingers tingling. The shop was disorienting, its shelves loaded with strange-looking multicolored books. The bell at the door kept ringing as people entered behind him. Each chime made Merlin anxiously peer over his shoulder. So many foreign sights and sounds invaded his senses. Distracted, he bumped a display table, and several books toppled to the floor. A man standing behind the counter shot him a jarring glare. Merlin's face reddened, and his adrenaline rushed through his bloodstream. He gave an uncomfortable nod to the man behind the counter, then plucked the books from the floor and replaced them on the table. Many strange eyes bore into him like he was a man possessed. Taking a breath, he narrowed his eyes, bringing his senses back into focus. He knew what he needed to do. The memory of Elanor and the old man was still fresh. Forcing aside his uneasiness, he squeezed around a line of shelves, frantically looking for the familiar corner where he had seen her. It must be there before she arrives, and I must... His mind tried to think as he rounded another shelf. I must use a shade. For he now understood that he was the old man in the memory. He had not used a shade in many years. As a practice of the old religion, it was not a magic he reached for. His Olam Dai had only just begun to teach him when he died. Merlin was so young in those days, just a boy. Others of the order tried to teach him, but those were the days when everything changed. The monks of Air had come, heralding news of the triple god and of Esu, fracturing the construct of the Druids forever. After all that had happened, it seemed unimportant to learn to shade. But the words of Dai remained within him, that his destiny would require certain skills. So he pressed into the power and eventually attained the art of mirroring, transforming his appearance. Though rarely did he use it, the shade always felt to him a forbidden magic. But this moment required it. He needed to transform if all was to happen as he had seen it in the memory. Flustered, Merlin's heart pounded in his ears. If only I could calm myself down and discover that blasted spot where I found her, where I will find her. He turned a corner and entered an open space with green, overstuffed chairs. An old man sat resting his chin on his palm as he read in the center chair. Merlin gasped, "It's him! The very same old man from the memory, with his small blue eyes, green wool cardigan, and sideways curling lips." Feeling strangely caught, Merlin ventured over to a line of bookshelves on the other side. The old man glanced up from his book and gave a sardonic laugh. "Young man, what are you wearing?" He smirked condescendingly. "Really the toggery you lads wear." Merlin halted and turned to the old man, patting his leather vest. "Toggery?" The old man grunted down at his book. "You appear lost in many more ways than just your attire." I. Foreign words tumbled out of Merlin's mouth, and he worried that they may not come out right. "Well, spit it out." The old man rolled his eyes and lifted his expectant brows. "Can a gent get any peace? I just left home because my wife couldn't stop chittering on, and now," he flailed his hand at Merlin, "I'm interrupted by a lad dressed as though it's time to retake the Highlands." "Retake the Highlands?" Merlin stared blankly at the old man, who made it abundantly clear Merlin was disturbing his peace. "So sorry. I'm searching for," he thought for what he could say, "books about King Arthur. Do you know where I could find them?" The man thumped his book closed. "You are looking for the Knights of the Round Table, eh?" he snickered. "Thought you would get dressed up all fancy to set the proper mood. Oh, I cannot wait to tell my Susie. She will have quite the laugh." Shaking his head, he continued to chortle with disdain as he rose from his seat. He shuffled feebly toward Merlin and pointed his finger to the left of Merlin. "Over there," he said, sniffing with a way of ushering Merlin forward. "Follow me." Merlin trailed behind the frail man's sauntering steps. The triumph that he would find the right place excited his spirit. He stared at the old man, taking his every detail. Here, they rounded the corner, and the man motioned for Merlin to follow in between two aisles of bookshelves, dead ending into a wall with a realistic picture of a fierce dragon painted on it. The old man ran his fingers across a line of books, pursing his lips as he read the title. "Aha," he grinned with a twinkle in his eye and pulled a red book from the shelf. An illustration of a warrior wielding a sword, and the words "King Arthur and his Knights" donned the cover. The old man slapped it into Merlin's chest. "Now you can be one of Arthur's men. Your delusions can come true." The man shook his head as he scooted away. "Wait," Merlin said, hoping to see the details of the man's face one more time. The man turned with a loud sigh. Merlin memorized the man's eyes, his white hair combed over to the side, and the silver stubble on his chin. "I do not have all day. Is there something else you want, or can I go back to my reading?" The old man hesitated and scrunched his wrinkled face, waiting for a reply, then swished his hand. "Pish-posh. Probably go back to my Susie. It's better than this lunacy." He waited one last second, but Merlin offered no final word. Before the agitated man even turned the corner, Merlin stood in the full shade of the old man, holding a book about Arthur in his hands. The bell at the front door jingled. Could it be her? He waited near the end of the row, glancing through the slit between the bookshelves, hoping he could spy her silken hair, turning the corner. Footsteps. Merlin quickly opened the book in his hands and pretended to scan the pages. His heart beat faster. He held his breath, and then a young man traipsed past. "Oh, great God," Merlin sighed in his relief. He wanted to see Elanor so badly, yet his restless nerves prickled at the thought of her appearing. What if she never even comes? He gulped, trying to calm himself. "I must stay focused, or else I will lose the shade." His thoughts tumbled with all he needed to say if she did appear. His palms moistened as he squeezed the pages of the book in his fingers. The bell jingled again. He whipped his head into the book as if the fiction would cover him. Sweat formed on his lip with anticipation. He paced his breath, setting his fingertips in the middle of his forehead. The thumping of the approaching footsteps distracted him. He must concentrate. His eyes focused on the pages, and he read the heading, Chapter 5, Arthur Meets Guinevere, when a figure entered the aisle. He could smell her, the scent that solely belonged to her, like lavender and honey. He dared not lift his eyes, but remained settled on the page, fearing what he might see when he lifted his head. She came closer, and his heart leapt into his throat. He couldn't resist. He raised his eyes over the lip of the book, and there she was. The brightness of her gaze pulled his heartstrings. He wanted to drop the book and embrace her, but he couldn't. Everything inside him ached to touch her, to feel her. But this was not his Elanor. Not yet. If he was to get through this moment, he would have to contain his emotions and not slip out of the shade. He clenched his jaw and gently exhaled. "Hello," Merlin said. His hands trembled, and he lowered them to his sides.
That is so good.
Thank you so much. That was actually really fun reading it out loud.
And you did a fantastic job.
Yeah.
Now, where can people buy your books?
Well, everywhere books are sold, you can buy the ebook, the hardback, and paperback on Amazon currently. And you should also be able to pick them up at Barnes and Noble.
That is fantastic. And I will have all of your information in the description of a podcast with links to your sites so people will be able to find you and your books very easily.
Thank you so very much.
And hopefully, whenever you get ready to put out book 3 in your series, you'll come back and do a reading from that one for us.
I would absolutely love to do that.
Now, what is the next book in your series?
The next book is Arthur and the Golden Dragon.
Oh, that sounds very promising.
Yeah, I'm very excited. I'm literally writing the final 3 chapters this weekend. So I'm very excited to have that book completed.
Thank you very much. And we'll talk to you again soon when book 3 is ready.
Thank you so much, Diane. This has been such a pleasure.
So there you have it, my happy people. A fantastic interview with the amazing historical epic fantasy author, Angela R. Hughes. If you haven't already started looking on the web for her books, you should do it right now. And while you're looking up her books, I wouldn't mind if you looked up mine. I do have my own book series, the Into the West Saga serial, which I currently write as Stephen Burkhart. That's StephenBurkhardt. I should try and plug my own books once in a while. Now, since we've already gone fairly long for today, I want to just quickly give you an update of the authors that we have coming up this next month. Starting next week, we have Donna Edmond, who is a photographer and visual storyteller. Her episode is number 71, and it will be available June 21st. After Donna, we have Wendy Jo Cerna, an inspirational author whose episode is 72 and will be up on June 28th. After Wendy Jo, we have Sabrina Hammonds, the owner of Kingdom Connections podcast and media agency. Her episode is number 73, and that will be broadcast on July 5th. After Sabrina Hammonds, we have Anne Charles, who is a mixed genre mystery author. Her episode is number 74 and will be available July 12th. After Anne Charles, we have Natasha Dean. She is a young adult, and a nonfiction author. She's very varied. Her episode is number 75 and will be available for broadcast on July 19th. After Natasha, we have Cammie Wood, the owner of Modern Wordist. She is a creative writing consultant. Her episode is number 76 and will be broadcast on July 26th. And honestly, people, I'm already getting August books, so please be sure to check burkhartbooks.com/podcast for all of the authors on our coming schedule. But now you know what time it is, people. It is time for you to go forth and please be happy.